This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. So much of your personal info is out of your control, like your insurance provider that has your social security number and your favorite retailer that has your payment details. If they get breached, your information, your identity, is vulnerable. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
What up, y'all? It's Joe Budden, here to talk about Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the best place to win real money while watching football. You can get up to 100 times your money.
Prize Picks will give you $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. Just download the Prize Picks app and use code SPOTIFY. That's code SPOTIFY on Prize Picks to get $50 instantly when you play a $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. Must be present in certain states. Visit prizepicks.com for restrictions and details.
Support for this podcast comes from CDTA, The Eagle, a Times Union podcast driven by CDTA. It's been a week, folks. The Times Union newsroom is still reeling from a very active election night and a subsequent few days. Many of us worked into the wee hours of the morning on Wednesday to bring you ballot counts and election results from across the state in real time. We all wore hats, as per tradition. We're not 100% sure why hats are the requisite attire on election night, but the sartorial choice was enshrined decades ago by the copy editing team. You can see us hard at work in our hats in a video that we posted on our social channels. Anyway, while the country, and likely most of the world, absorbed the results of the US presidential election on Wednesday, we were also processing the results of key races here in New York. It was no surprise that New York's 28 electoral votes went to Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris. But President-elect Donald Trump did get significantly more votes in New York than he did in 2020 or in 2016. We have plenty of analysis of that outcome over at timesunion.com and at capitalconfidential.com. We also heard from New York Governor Kathy Hochul on Wednesday.
I will be very clear. While we honor the results of this election and will work with anyone who wants to be a partner in achieving the goals of our administration and our state, that does not mean we'll accept an agenda from Washington that strips away the rights that New Yorkers have long enjoyed.
Hochul celebrated the passage of Proposition 1, a measure that expands civil rights and codifies the protections of Roe v. Wade statewide.
I need to remind everyone, this is the birthplace of the women's rights movement, the environmental justice movement, the LGBTQ rights movement, and the American labor movement. With that as part of our history, our story, New York will remain a bastion for freedom and rule of law. And over the next coming weeks, and indeed years, I'll do everything in my power to ensure that New York remains a bastion from efforts where those rights are being denied in other states.
Prop 1 was expected to pass, so again, not a surprising outcome. But what was less predictable, however, were contentious races for New York's congressional seats. The balance of power in the U.S. House of Representatives rests on a razor-thin margin, and New York voters this week flipped some key seats from red to blue. Joining me now to analyze the results of those races is Capitol Bureau reporter Raga Justin. It was a big night, obviously. We were both in the newsroom wearing our hats as per tradition, having some pizza. And you were watching the key races in New York, in the state. Obviously, people had an eye on the presidential election, right? That happens every 4 years. And there were some major developments that came out of that. But what about New York? What were some of the most important results to pay attention to that came out of the state?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the congressional races were pretty top of mind for the state Democrats, at least, and Republicans as well, because the control of the U.S. House of Representatives is what is important here. It was sort of anticipated that Republicans were going to take the Senate. Obviously, the White House is now going to be occupied by President-elect Donald Trump, a Republican. And so I think the U.S. House of Representatives, as the governor said yesterday when making her first remarks since the results had been announced, they have been viewing this as kind of a firewall, a way to basically shore up a line of defense, if there are any policies coming from the White House or from the Senate that Democrats don't like, they view the House as their best opportunity to sort of, block those. And because of that, there were a couple of seats in New York that were really, really highly watched, very visible races. There were about 5 of them that we were paying attention to. So that was New York's 4th congressional district in Long Island, and then a couple in the Hudson Valley, and then one in central New York, which is the 22nd congressional district. And ultimately, it was a pretty good night for Democrats running in those congressional races. They managed to pick up 3 seats, so flip them, from the Republican incumbents that had been there before. They managed to defend 1 congressional district in the Hudson Valley. That was Pat Ryan, who was up against Republican Allison Esposito. They managed to hold on to that one. And they lost a race that they had sort of expected to lose. That was the Mondaire Jones versus incumbent Mike Lawler race in New York 17. And we don't really know nationally what's going to play out with the House of Representatives. A lot of races have not been called yet. But as Kathy Hochul said yesterday, we've done our part. We've given you those seats. So
those races too, I mean, you were following them throughout the campaign season. They were intense, right? There was a lot of intensity in a lot of those races, especially in the Hudson Valley. And now, with the election over, kind of looking back on that, what do you have any thoughts on that and how that played a role in any of the results?
Yeah, I mean, they were kind of ugly. There was a lot of, if not vitriol, at least just a lot of money. I mean, there was a lot of money being poured into these races and a lot of barbs and kind of these really not personal attacks, but really cutting attacks in mailers, political advertisements. There were a lot of them. I think that's the one thing people took away is like in New York 19, which was between Josh Wiley and Mark Molinaro, the Republican incumbent, you couldn't turn on a TV or like watch a YouTube video without being flooded with political ads. So I think people just noticed the volume, and then the tone was definitely pretty heated, especially around these top issues that, Republicans and Democrats have been sparring on for the past several months, including like immigration and border security. I think that's where we really saw some of the heat and the fire. And to your point, this wasn't just in New York 19. This is the closest race to me that we were paying attention to. So that's the one that I was noticing the most. But this was happening. This was happening everywhere. This was happening with John Mannion and Brandon Williams in central New York. This was happening down in Long Island, where there were all these sort of last minute stories coming out about the Republican candidate in that case, putting people who are close to him on payrolls and maybe an inappropriate manner. So yeah, just a lot of the, I guess, kind of storm that we would expect to see in political campaigns was really apparent.
Now, what about at the state level? I know that there were 200 some odd, races at the state level for the legislature, but were there any like really notable outcomes that you can think of?
It does appear that the state legislature, the Democrats, are expected to maintain their majorities. We don't know about the supermajorities yet, but it seems like they weren't concerned about about ceding much control to Republicans. I think the one notable loss of the night happened down in Brooklyn, where State Senator Iwan Chu lost to a Republican, Steve Chan. And that was kind of a notable race for a lot of reasons. I think it kind of pitted two Asian American candidates against each other, for one. Two, it was kind of indicative of this larger narrative, especially like in New York City, in the five boroughs, that Republicans appear to be making inroads, and there was a lot of room for optimism for the Republican Party in New York City, especially. Obviously, at the top of the ticket with Donald Trump, but then you see it in these kind of smaller races, right? These more local races. Yeah.
Do you think is it just, kind of trickle down from the top effects, or is there something else that, you've been able to discern was the reason for that flip and more Republican voting happening in New York City, which is traditionally like the bluest part of the state that, you can get?
I do believe there's some kind of party conflicts down there. A lot of, infighting. I think people are, again, writ large, like not very happy with Democrats right now. And you see that, like you said, in these places that have historically been such blue strongholds. The idea is that we're up against the Democratic establishment. And when you're positioning yourself as an outsider to that, and you've got voters who are unhappy with the way that their lives have been going for the past couple of years, you're going to start seeing, I guess, some of those inroads. Big issue was affordability. I'm not sure if Chew necessarily was a casualty of this, but I know that Democrats across the board were. The idea that people's lives are getting more expensive, especially if you're living paycheck to paycheck. The narrative is that the economy has not been great for the working class, and Democrats did suffer as a result of not being able to shift that narrative.
All right. So the other bit of kind of major election results that came out of New York was the passage of Prop 1. Voters voted, fairly overwhelmingly yes on that. Well, how did that come out?
Yeah, I think people were definitely relieved when Prop 1 passed. Not that it was ever really expected to fail, but there was a last minute sort of dark money campaign that was funded from the right that I think made a lot of Democrats sort of sit up and say, whoa, we need to do something about this. A really interesting kind of anecdote to that is I voted on election day. I voted very early morning. And as I left my house, I noticed that there was a volunteer, from the New Yorkers for Equal Rights campaign, which has been really backing Prop 1, camped outside of the polling site, within the legal distance or whatever. And I was asking her, why are you guys here? And she was like, well, it's this kind of last minute ground game strategy that we're trying to do because essentially, they were a little worried. They were running a little scared because of all the money that had been poured in to try to defeat Prop 1. But like you said, it did pass with a pretty comfortable majority. And it's being used now as a talking point by Democratic leaders. Attorney General Letitia James and Governor Kathy Hochul, both Democrats, both women, were kind of side by side yesterday, again in their first televised remarks or first remarks since the results had been announced. And they said, look, it's sort of a symbol, right, of New York's position as a reproductive rights haven. We are doing everything in our power to ensure that continues to be the case. And Proposition 1 is sort of, as Kathy Hochul called it, the glimmer of hope from last night or from 2 nights ago.
Kind of forward looking in the sort of immediate future, right? Like New York State's going to get back to business soon. What are some of the things that you're going to be watching as that happens?
Well, obviously, we're setting up a really interesting political dynamic now, where the state has sort of made itself visible as opponents, if not to Donald Trump himself, at the very least his policies. And so the federal government is going to be a factor here, right? And New York, which is pretty reliant on the feds for certain things such as Medicaid funding, transportation funding. There's going to be a delicate sort of push and pull here as we move forward into like our budget session. I know that congestion pricing has been top of mind for a lot of people. That's definitely going to be coming up again. Like I said, Medicaid, one of the biggest policy issues in New York, it's going to come back up, especially as we get into next year with the start of this new administration. And I think that Democrats are now again saying, well, if something else is to happen, if there's a further attempt to sort of curtail reproductive rights, then we have to be prepared for that.
For our complete election coverage and results analysis, head on over to timesunion.com. That's it for this week. The Eagle is a production of the Times-Union. It's produced and edited by myself, Jessica Marshall, with help from the Times-Union digital team and the newsroom. Our music is Flyin' by Top Floor. Special thanks to Raga Justin for her contributions to this episode. Questions or comments? Email us at podcast@timesunion.com.